Welcome to another in our series of Under the Redwoods, the webinar in which we explore really all things redwood, from their history, science, the benefits they provide to us, on and on and on, the inspiration they provide. Sempervirens Fund acknowledges that the land where we work in the Santa Cruz Mountains and the redwood forests, which we work to conserve, were among the ancestral lands for many indigenous peoples who cared for these lands for millennia until they were forcibly removed from the landscape. We are grateful today to be working with some of their descendants, in particular the Muwekma Ohlone people and the Amamutsan tribal band, as we support them in beginning to restore their cultural practices and connection to this amazing landscape. I want to thank everyone for joining us today and for being adaptable. We tried a new technology last month and we're back to Zoom because we found that it worked better. So hopefully that will work for all of you as well, our audience. As always, we will be recording this webinar and you can find it later on our website. Also, as always, if you have questions you'd like to ask, you can use the chat function or the Q&A function at the bottom of the page. And we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible during the webinar, and in some cases, even post-webinar. So ask away. This is a really interesting topic today, so I'm hoping there will be a lot of questions, actually. Thank you. Before we move on, I want to make sure I mention that this webinar series is sponsored by Scharf Investments. Thank you to them for supporting us in this fun and important webinar series. We have a lot happening in 2022. It's going to be a big year for sempervirens and for redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains. As many of you know, if you've been following what we've been up to, in late January, we purchased a new property, the gateway to Big Basin State Park. And since taking ownership, we've been delighted to get out onto the property and have a much closer look than we were able to have before. And what we are finding is that the forests are in really excellent condition, and that's fantastic. And that just makes us even more convinced that this new property, the gateway property, is going to be a key component of the larger effort to both reimagine and reopen Big Basin State Park. So thank you to those of you watching who helped support that campaign. Secondly, I want to mention that in the next few months, later this summer really, we are expecting San Vicente Redwoods property that we co-own with our partners at Post to be open to the public for the first time ever, really, for recreation. And that is the result of an innovative partnership in conjunction with our friends at the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County to build some trails and set up a monitoring program to understand what recreation is meaning on those trails, and really open this amazing property up to visitors. So if you live anywhere near the region and would like to visit this amazing redwood forest and see some of the restoration projects that we've been involved with there over the last decade, check out our website and you can get information about when the property is finally open to the public. And then the last thing I want to mention, especially because I don't want to have to wait to see all of you until San Vicente Redwoods opens to the public, we are hosting a very special, unique for sempervirens event on Earth Day, April 22nd, a Hug a Tree Challenge, in which we're inviting all tree lovers, redwoods or otherwise, to participate in our effort to get into the Guinness World Book of Records. It may sound crazy, but it's actually been really fun, and it doesn't require that you be in the Santa Cruz Mountains to participate. If you are able to get to the Santa Cruz Mountains on Earth Day, April 22nd, you can join us live and in person at this world record-breaking event, but you don't have to be there to participate. You can participate in your own backyard, anywhere you happen to be where there's a tree that needs a hug. So check out our website, sempervirens.org, to get more information about this cool, fun, very positive event that we are hosting. Moving on to more sober topics, earlier this month, we launched a year-long series that is really dedicated to the exploration of climate change and its association with redwoods, the anticipated impacts, and other associated things. If you missed some of the earlier materials we put out, that too is on our website. But it's appropriate then that we have this webinar in which we're really taking a look into the far, far past, researching the paleontological record, excuse me, to better understand how climate has impacted the landscape within which we operate, and perhaps derive some lessons for what it might mean going forward for the redwood forest that we care so much about. And interestingly, redwoods play a very key role in this research. So I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Jason Addison. He's with the U.S. Geological Survey, a paleooceanographer, and he's going to be joined later by one of his colleagues to talk to us a bit about what we can understand about our deep past and what it might mean going forward. So welcome, Jason. Delighted to have you.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Sarah. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with everyone. All right, so today I'm going to show you some research that myself and colleagues at the USGS and elsewhere have been developing from the coastline of California for quite a few years. I've been fortunate to work with some really amazing people. In particular, two people whom I'm going to really highlight today are Dr. John Barron from the USGS, whom you'll hear from later today during our question and answer panel session, as well as some really fascinating pollen work by Dr. Linda Heusser of Columbia University out in New York. I'm also, I've worked with a number of other amazing people, but through this talk, I've also been fortunate to be able to include some work from the Inkdwell Studios, led by Jane Kim and Danza Davis and Katie Michaels. So keep an eye out for some of that artwork as we go through this. Right. So my talk today is going to be broken into 3 different pieces. We're going to start by drawing connections between the Pacific Ocean and ancient climate using the science of paleooceanography. Then I'm going to talk a bit about some Holocene work from the last 7,300 years or so from the Northern California coast, which coast redwoods actually turn out to play an important role in. Then I'm going to finish today with a brief overview of some work my research team at the USGS is working on right now in Monterey Bay, studying the history of harmful algal blooms. All right. Oh, I forgot. I have animations. All right. So the research I'm going to talk today about is centered around studying Pacific Ocean climate variability, which exerts a strong influence on a number of environmental factors, including precipitation patterns, marine ecosystem health, and even continental climate. However, the future of the Pacific Ocean is uncertain, and particularly in the context of projected climate change. Now, the interrelationship between ocean conditions, atmospheric conditions through fog, a ground level cloud, and actually the coast redwoods along the California coast is a dynamic example of Pacific Ocean continent connections. So this is a summertime satellite photo of the northern end of San Francisco Bay. And as you can see, it has our classic marine layer moving into the northern end of the bay. Let's see, I'm going to make my pointer visible. Yeah, this is the marine layer. It's derived, from the evaporation of the shallow ocean offshore. And as it interacts with the atmosphere, you get condensation. That condensation can get very thick. And it turns out, as many of you already know, that leads to a really interesting way to give precipitation and moisture to the coast redwoods. This is a really important way that they collect moisture, especially during the summer months. Now, I am a paleooceanographer, which is a ocean scientist that studies the past. And so I use geological records to try to understand how the past can offer insight into the future. So the geologic record offers an opportunity to understand how potential future conditions affect the Earth. This plot is the global temperature curve of the last 65 million years, split into different time steps plotted along the bottom. So this is the last 100 years and into the future. These are thousands of years before present, 10,000 years, 20,000 years, 300,000 years into the past, and then finally into millions of years into the past, 1 million, 5 million, 65 million years. Along the left-hand side of this plot is global temperature relative to today. And so that's what this zero measure is, and the dashed line. Now, on the right of this image, we have both recent, the last 150 years of time, as well as future IPCC projections for future temperatures out into 2300. And it's using different greenhouse gas scenarios. To the left is obviously the vast gulf of geologic time, where I've highlighted different intervals of heating in Earth's history. For instance, 6,000 years ago, the mid-Holocene was about 0.7 degrees Celsius warmer than today. Moving further back to the interglacials of the Pleistocene, anywhere from 1 million to 100,000 years ago, we see temperatures that range around about 1 degree warmer during certain periods of time. Moving even further back into the mid-Pliocene, around 3 million years ago, where carbon dioxide levels are similar to what we see today, temperatures were warmer anywhere from almost 2 degrees to 3.5 degrees warmer. And then finally, if we go back to the very beginning of this curve into the period of time called the Eocene, 50 million years ago, with radically high CO2 levels, temperatures were possibly as high as 13 degrees warmer than now. This is a very doom and gloom plot, especially when you realize our near future 2100 years, or 2100 common era, that's what the CE means, is projected to resemble the Pliocene. Now, an important question to ask yourself when you see these kinds of plots are, how are they made? And so I want to spend just a few minutes talking about that. And so this is from the ocean perspective, so the science of paleooceanography, all right? So how do we know about past climate conditions along California's coasts? Well, it starts, of course, by collecting samples from the seafloor. And that requires ships that, research vessels, that can be anywhere from a small chain array, which operates out of the Santa Cruz Harbor, it's a converted fishing vessel, to seriously gargantuan research vessels. This is the research drilling vessel Chikyu that operates out of Japan. It's almost 700 feet long. It is behemoth. It also collects kilometers of drill cores from the seafloor. There are also other technologies out there beyond just ships. Remotely operated vehicles such as the Dock Ricketts, which is operated out of the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, just down the road from Santa Cruz. Now, all of these are really great workhorses for operating one of the main sampling tools that I use, which is called a jumbo piston core. You can think of it as an enormous syringe that is biopsying the surface sediments of the ocean. This is the deployment weight stand. It weighs over 2,000 pounds. This pipe is filled with a plastic core liner. And so when it's deployed off the back of the ship, it dangles in this activated position. There is a trigger core that hits the seafloor and releases a safety restraint that allows the piston core to free fall about 20 meters or so to make maximum impact down into the sediment. Now, what does that look like when it comes back to the lab? Well, we collect sediment cores in this type of system, and the type of record we recover is dependent on how active the seafloor biotic community is. Now, in a situation where there's no stirring of mud by bottom-dwelling organisms, such as in areas of low dissolved oxygen content or anoxia, you can preserve what are called varves or seasonal laminations. These are essentially the sediment equivalent of tree rings. They're extremely rare in ocean settings and represent pristine sediments. Now, what we normally see, however, on the seafloor, especially along the California margin, are indicators of a healthy bottom ecosystem where there's plenty of dissolved oxygen for the worms and crabs and snails that live at the seafloor. And we know this because they actively feed through the sediment column. And so they actually mix up. We call this bioturbation. They actually mix up these layers that would normally be preserved. Now, what's really interesting is, in spite of the amount of mixing these organisms do to the mud, we still can collect very useful information through time, okay? Basically, this bioturbation acts as a time filter where these layers are still preserved. They've just been filtered, sort of smeared out, if you will. So you can't preserve like seasonal variability, but at years to decades to centuries, that kind of information is still preserved in very high fidelity. And we know this because we can tell time in sediment cores. And it starts by applying one of the, what we call the ancient laws of geology, the law of superposition. The oldest sediment is at the base of the sediment core with the youngest sediment at the top. From there, we apply different types of tools to tell time, or geochronology. And it includes things such as identifying the presence or absence of particular fossils that are associated with different time periods, the magnetic signature of the sediments, chemical markers, sometimes volcanic ash horizons. And then there's, of course, the workhorse of sediment core dating, radiometric dating, which is a measurement that's derived from the decay of naturally occurring radioactive elements. One of the ones that most people are familiar with is, of course, radiocarbon, or C14. However, there are many other elements out there on the periodic table that have some of that same kind of behavior, such as argon, uranium, samarium, some really exotic elements that don't really make it into the everyday lexicon of most folks. And so applying these tools, such as C14 dating of organic fossils, it turns out this particular sediment core from Alaska is about 3,200 years old, which is pretty exciting. Okay, so once we have our sediment core, we know how old it is. We then apply different proxy measurements, okay? we're making measurements in sediment cores that reflect some part of the ocean or climate system, okay? So a common component are microfossils, where we actively separate out tiny shells of diatoms, which are the single cell algae that are a phytoplankton, a type of, it's related to a plant, that live in the surface waters of the ocean and are the base of the ecosystem. In the sediments, we can also find other types of phytoplankton, such as silica flagellates. We also sometimes find the hard parts of what are called primary consumers, or a type of zooplankton, like a foraminifera. We even sometimes find pollen from land. This is an example of a coast redwood pollen, but all of these things are contained in the sediments that accumulate at the bottom of the ocean. There are also geochemical signatures that accumulate and we commonly use, and I'll talk a little bit about some of these today, but I don't want to spend too much time going into how these things work, but we can talk about it later if you'd like to. One that I do want to point out, though, is biogenic silica. This is the glassy hard parts of diatoms that are preserved in the sediment. We use a chemical extraction to measure the concentration and use that to infer ancient phytoplankton productivity. Okay, so once we've had, collected our sediment core, we've figured out how old it is, and we've measured proxies, then we sit around and think about how to interpret that data. And so this is an example from the far northern coast of California at an ocean drilling program site. This is actually data that my colleague, Dr. Linda Heuser, generated a few years ago. And it is the pollen record. In this particular case, I want to call out the fact that it actually has redwood pollen several hundred miles offshore from the coast. And that redwood pollen shows several periods going down the core where we have very significant levels of redwood pollen accumulating. And what's really interesting is there are times when those peaks in redwoods are also associated with peaks in oak, peaks in alder, sometimes ferns. And at the same time, there are declines in other types of forest species, such as spruce and hemlock. So this is a way to actually look at an ancient ecosystem. Now, using the geochronology tools we talked about earlier, you can convert the depth scale on this plot over into time, and then apply yet a different proxy, in this case, one that measures ocean surface temperatures. We find that the redwood pollen is also associated with warm periods in the geological record over hundreds of thousands of years of time. Okay, and so it turns out these periods of time actually represent the classic glacial or interglacial timescales of the Pleistocene. These are the ancient ice ages. They're naturally occurring. They are related to changes in the Earth's orbital configuration as it revolves around the sun. And it's classically referred to as Milankovitch theory. And we can talk about this later too. But what I want to highlight is that at this time scale from this sediment record, it's really hard to know what's happening at really small time scales. So say the last 10,000 years, which is a buildup to what I actually want to talk about now. So we're going to do have a quick overview of some research that myself and John Barron led a few years ago, where we're looking at the upwelling record for the last 7,300 years. So upwelling is a very important component of ocean circulation, especially here in California, where it brings up deep cold water to the surface. This is related to how the wind flows southwards along our coast. It causes water surface waters, warmer waters, to actually move offshore and generates a little bit of a hole that upwelled cold water tries to fill. That deep cold water is also full of nutrients, and so it helps to generate a beautiful phytoplankton bloom. That's why these waters are green here. Those nutrients are helping to support the diatom community, which is then consumed by consumers such as zooplankton, which are then lead to anchovies and fish and sharks and whales. It basically feeds the whole ecosystem. All right. In California, particularly at our latitudes in Central California, this is a plot that shows coastal upwelling intensity. And you can see that during the summer months, that's when it's most intense. During the winter months, it tends to be almost non-existent. Now, this upwelling also is what leads to fog generation, because the fog represents a condensation of that moisture from the ocean that helps, as I said earlier, it helps to lead to watering the coastal redwoods. So upwelling clearly has a big impact on fisheries, marine tourism, climate along the US West Coast. So understanding the future of upwelling is going to be really important in the next few years. And so sophisticated climate models are trying to make those kinds of projections. And these 4 boxes represent the 4 main areas of upwelling in the world's oceans. So off the coast of Africa in 2 locations, South America, and of course, the US West Coast. The climate models are very clear with the African margin, as well as South America. California, however, there's a lot more uncertainty in the projection of upwelling intensity over the next 100 years. And so trying to understand better what's happening as conditions change is really important. And so geologic records can help to lead to a better understanding here. And so we looked at a sediment core from just outside of Eureka, California. It's pretty close to the coast. This color band along the coast, this actually represents phytoplankton blooms as measured by satellites. And you can see that those blooms are really intense right along the coast. And that's because that's where the upwelling cell is situated. And you know this because, as I said earlier, upwelling brings cold water to the surface. This is a map of temperatures of the ocean surface. And again, lots of cold temperatures all along here because of upwelling. Okay, so this is a really busy graphic. And it is the sort of the raw nuts and bolts of what paleooceanographers look at when they're trying to interpret data. There are things like biogenic silica and proxies for nutrients. We even have microfossils, such as a diatom indicator of upwelling, but there's also an indicator of upwelling. This is our sequoia pollen, the coastal redwood. This is a very busy graphic, and thanks to the fine folks at Inkwell Studios, we have something way nicer to look at. So what is important to look at here is the change in everything that happens. This is a sediment core. It's collected from the edge of the continental shelf. So oldest at the bottom, youngest at the top. The pollen and the diatom fossils that are preserved in the sediments change over time. And around 3,000 years ago, this is actually when we see pollen that's derived primarily from redwoods overtaking the record, as well as diatoms that are associated with those upwelling conditions. So it suggests that around 3,000 years ago, the coastal California ecosystem underwent a pretty significant intensification of upwelling. Again, I'd like to really thank Inkwell Studios for this work. It's a beautiful diagram. Okay, now the only thing I want to take from this also very busy graphic is that we have the Paleooceanographic community has assembled other records from all along the California, Oregon, and Washington coast using similar data. And what we find is that shift at 3,000 years ago in our record from Northern California, it tends to be associated with similar changes in other settings. In particular, there's this one sediment core not too far away from our record we were talking about, where temperature was actually measured using a proxy for a biomarker compound called an alkanone. And what we find is that at the same period as our increased upwelling, as indicated by diatoms, the redwood pollen, and other things, there appears to also be an uptick in warmth of the ocean surface. So that is a very interesting scenario. We're not 100% sure why it looks warmer, but the reality is that's what the data says. So we've got some hypotheses that we can talk about later, but I want to go ahead and move on because I know I'm starting to run a little long. So the last piece of my talk, I want to talk about some stuff that my research team at the USGS is developing from Monterey Bay. We've been working on a set of sediment cores. Each one of these points is a different sediment core that was collected over 3 cruises from 2015 to 2017. They're all from the shallow continental shelf. And the record that I want to talk about today is from the southern end. It's actually a stone's throw from Monterey, not so surprisingly. So in this particular sediment core, there are extreme numbers of a harmful algal bloom species, a diatom called Pseudonychia. And there are 2 species, in fact. One is this australis, and another is multiceres. They are pretty gnarly things. They generate a toxin called domoic acid. And we'll talk a little bit about what that neurotoxin does in just a moment. But what's really amazing here is that these 2 sediment cores for the last 100 years or so, back to 1880 versus 2020 on the bottom axis here, we see very high levels of these particular toxic diatoms that show up basically after about 1960, but really big blooms starting in the late 90s and into the 2000s. So Pseudonychia generates this toxin, domoic acid. It leads to a condition called paralytic shellfish poisoning, and it manifests in a number of ways. This poor pelican is demonstrating its impacts on its neurological system. Newspapers from the 1960s also document some things. So the first direct observation of Pseudonychia blooms in Monterey Bay happened in 1991, and that's where the photo of this pelican was taken. However, it impacts lots of seabirds, and in Capitola in 1961, there is likely another one of these blooms occurred 30 years earlier. This is a newspaper report that is talking about how sooty shearwaters were documented slamming into buildings and the people. If this is sounding familiar, it should. This was the inspiration for the Alfred Hitchcock movie, The Birds. This event was later discovered that museum collections of zooplankton taken from some of these birds were chock full of this Pseudonychia diatom. Now, so we have an event that happened probably 1961, a big event that happened in 1991, And then during the El Nino of 1997 to 1998, there was another large pseudonychia bloom in Monterey Bay. And there have been several that have happened ever since. And now it appears that pseudonychia blooms have become established semi-regularly along the Central California coast. The largest bloom ever recorded happened in 2014 to 2016. It was associated with the North Pacific warm water anomaly that's called the blob. This warm water anomaly was so large that it allowed tropical species such as hammerhead sharks to actually move all the way up into Prince William Sound in Alaska. That's a tropical species that move 3,000 kilometers northward. Crazy. So anyway, all of this leads me to ask the question, do these pseudonychia blooms predate the observational record? So this is that record of diatoms from Monterey Bay compared against data sets from elsewhere along the California margin, Santa Barbara Basin. This is a record that my colleague John Barron generated a few years ago, as well as some other records from the Gulf of Mexico and even the North Sea out in the Atlantic Ocean. What we find is that all of these records, particularly after the 1980s and into the 1990s, have big peaks, okay? Only Monterey Bay seems to have a big peak in the 1960s. It also occurs, the pseudonychia, the toxic diatom, at extremely small levels as early as 1880 in Santa Barbara. Now, you might be wondering, why am I only showing you data sets from these three areas? Well, it turns out downcore observations of this diatom are rare, and it's because these are very delicate diatoms, so it's hard to preserve them. So what can we say from the paleo perspective here? What role has past climate or upwelling dynamics played in Monterey Bay? So looking at the record of our toxic diatom at the very top here, we see that one of these early peaks in the species multi-series corresponds to the 1997 El Nino event. That's not terribly surprising. That matches the observational record. We also see that there are other peaks that don't really line up as well, but there is a giant peak in 2016, which is also associated with one of the strongest El Nino events that's ever been recorded. An earlier peak, however, back in the 1960s, doesn't appear to have any clear Enso relation. It could probably be any of these if it is in fact related to El Nino. Looking at other data sets, such as a record of upwelling in Monterey Bay, combined with a diatom proxy from our sediment core, we find that the instrumental record is consistent with what we see in the sediment core. Using geochemical proxies for productivity, we also find that a consistency here. But what's important is that both the productivity 1960, after 1960 is when our first occurrence in the geological record of pseudonychia occurs. Now, we have further studies underway in Monterey Bay, but I don't want to bore you guys too much with talking about mud. You can tell I'm very excited about that. So instead, I'm going to go ahead and conclude here. Hopefully I've convinced you that there's a tight interrelationship between the Pacific Ocean, climate, and West Coast marine and terrestrial ecosystems. And the geological record provides dynamic examples. Furthermore, that studying the past offers key insights into the future. The blob that I mentioned earlier was unprecedented in modern history and is not foreseen by climate models. However, analogs do appear to exist in the geological record. So by combining our modern instrument-based climate observations with a healthy understanding of the geological past, hopefully we can start to get a good grapple on some of the changes that are going to be occurring in our near future. Thank you for your attention. And I just want to finish with an example of a MetaSequoia that I have seen in Fairbanks, Alaska. It's a petrified fossil from 55 million years ago. It's a phenomenal place. There's a whole petrified forest preserved up there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. And I think we're going to be joined now by your colleague, John. And I think
yes.
if you want to take
yes, this is Dr. John Barron. He is an emeriti researcher from the USGS. John and I have worked together for almost 2 decades now. John is a preeminent expert on diatoms, the single-celled algae that played a really important part of the talk that I presented today. And so hopefully the two of us can work on answering some of the questions that you guys have after this presentation.
Thanks, Jason. And I think you can, if you want, take your, there we go. Now I can see you better. And I apologize, something is irritating my eye. So if I look like I'm crying, I'm not upset by your talk. I have something in my eye. So going back to one of your earlier slides, you talked about the upwelling and the conditions it generates that helps redwoods thrive in this region and many other things. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about what you see happening now and what your research from the past suggests we might be facing going forward, if anything, that you can derive from the past information.
Well, one of the things that some of those model studies of future upwelling suggest is that it looks like upwelling will likely continue to increase. However, because there is so much uncertainty, and a lot of that is actually derived from the fact that there are lots of natural cycles that occur in the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah.
El Nino is one classic example. Another is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. Those cycles make it actually very difficult to really understand how upwelling will change in the future. However, with that said, it does suggest that there could be intensification soon.
Mm-hmm. Which might actually be good for redwoods, I suppose.
Potentially.
Potentially.
I mean, the reality is, redwoods have a lot to contend with, more than just the amount of fog that's available.
Yeah, well, and this audience has heard a lot about wildfire because, of course, the region within which we work was hit recently by a very significant wildfire. We're experiencing drought in this region, all of which impacts the redwoods and associated. We focus on redwoods, but really we're talking about the overall landscape. But it sounds like on the ocean side of things, we may not be seeing necessarily such a harmful circumstance. Are you seeing patterns of fog change, or do you anticipate patterns of fog? I think it had been on my mind, and then I think I saw somebody just pop it up in the chat as a question.
Yeah, I see that too. Actually, it's an excellent question. Well, I'm not a fog researcher myself. There is a really fascinating body of literature about this, however. A key paper I want to mention to you is Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Back in 2010, a pair of authors, Jim Johnstone and Todd Dawson, actually prepared a paper exactly on that question. Coupled with their observations of shifts in ocean climate and increases in temperature, they're projecting that there could be a reduction in fog in the future. So, yeah.
Which would be very
consequential. For redwoods,
obviously. Very, especially if it's coupled with drought. Then that's quite consequential. I'm curious, you talked about looking at the sediment core. It must be extremely cool to be able to see and imagine the breadth of time that you're looking at in that slug of mud that you've pulled out of the ocean. Can give us a sense what it looks like as you're looking at, you know, sort of geologic time, and then the arrival of industrialization. Can you see it? And what does that tell us about what's happened since then? Because we hear about it in the climate change context, right, atmospherically, but I have to imagine it's reflected in your ocean cores.
John, would you like to take this one?
Well, an interesting thing about the rise of industrialization, you know, is taking place in the 1800s. And it's also coinciding with what's called the Little Ice Age, the end of that. So around about 1850, we get increased coal burning and such. We also get the climate change that's associated with the decline of the Little Ice Age. So a lot of people have speculated that the Little Ice Age was actually ended by, you know, increased coal into the atmosphere, which caused increased CO2. So this is one of the enigmas of trying to study climate change, is what is the driving force, you know? So it is a very, very intriguing question. And of course, you know, people have been looking into this from various aspects.
So one of your earliest slides in your presentation showed sort of this spectrum of temperature. And on the left side was what I would consider geologic time. That might not be the right term, but you showed millions of years, then thousands of years, and then hundreds of years. And it looked to me, so I'm testing this with you, tell me if I understood it correctly. It looked to me like the more recent history, the temperature variation was within the spectrum of what we see across geologic time. However, it seemed like the rapidity with which the temperature change was happening over hundreds of years, as opposed to what had been occurring previously across millions or at least thousands of years.
That's exactly right.
And so what does that mean? Help us understand what that might mean.
It's, you know, rates of change here. It's definitely a rate of change that is what the world is seeing, that's unlike anything we've seen in the past. That particular plot is kind of weird to look at just because it jumps between time periods so quickly. But the rate of increase in projected temperatures is on the order of something we haven't seen since, what is it, the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum, which is about 50 some odd million years ago. It was this little blip. It basically, temperatures almost over what would look, geologically speaking, overnight rapidly increased, similar to what we see today. So it's scary.
So I'm going to give a layperson's interpretation of this and tell me if this is correct. So if you're a forest, if you're a redwood forest, and the temperature is changing over the course of, say, thousands of years, certainly over millions of years, you might have the opportunity to migrate at the pace that a forest is capable of migrating, you know, I don't know, inches a year or something, to move on to a new part of the landscape where you could survive as previous areas become inhospitable to you due to climate change. We've got your feline friend visiting us. But if the temperature change is so rapid as seems to be happening now, there's going to be much greater difficulty, I would guess, in for a species like a tree species that's not able to migrate rapidly to adapt. Is that, you know, is that one of the implications of what you're showing us in terms of the various data points that you're finding and information you've shared?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's exactly right. Sedentary species like plants, redwoods, exactly. But not just terrestrial species, marine species too. They're not as there you go. They're not as adaptable, kelp forests. They can only move as fast as they can disperse their offspring. And so with something like redwoods, which require intense burning, not too intense, to
Yeah.
propagate. I mean, that's hard to really engineer like that. So, John, you have some thoughts there?
I guess I'd say something also is that along with climate change and human disturbance, we have increased landslides.
Mm-hmm.
And if anybody's been in the Santa Cruz Mountains, they know that the trees that grow back very quickly in landslide areas are going to be things like laurels, and that they're almost like weeds. And this is the same thing with that toxic algae. It can outcompete. Grasses can outcompete. So on the periphery of redwood forests, if you get human disturbance of land, and you don't, if it just as you said, you're buying up all kinds of forests to protect them from human disturbance, this can be a large threat to redwoods. So it's a complicated issue.
Yeah. Well, when I think across deep time about the natural ebb and flow of species in any particular location, the abundance of the species, as well as the distribution, and just the variation, right? We used to have saber-toothed tigers. We don't anymore. When I think across that time horizon, I feel more optimistic about just the viability of nature. But I guess it is sobering to think about what it might mean for a very specific species like coast redwoods, right?
Yes.
And so as you think about it, do you look at these forests and feel optimism, pessimism? What are your, I mean, you all have heads full of information about this. When you walk amongst those big giants, do you think they have thousands more years ahead of them? Or do you think the pace of change climatologically is so significant that it's sobering?
So
be gentle with this audience. This is a group of redwood lovers.
No, it's not an easy answer. That straight up. But I am always a glass half full person. And the reason I put a picture of a MetaSequoia 55 million years old in the very last slide is because of that optimism. The redwoods have seen a lot of change over the course of their species. I hope that with careful stewardship from humanity, that we'll continue to be able to have those be part of our lives. I mean, I'm not a redwood ecologist, I'm not a redwood biologist, but speaking as a paleooceanographer that sees evidence of these things far offshore, I'm optimistic.
Right.
I mean, the work that our colleague Linda Heusser did on that record, the 500,000-year-old sediment core from Northern California that has very clear points where there are lots of redwoods 500,000 years ago. That gives me hope. It makes me think that there is some resiliency built in, but it's not something that's really easy for us to predict.
So the redwoods, current coast redwoods, I believe the species is tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions years old, and that there's evidence of them in the record, some of which you alluded to. So arguably they've been through tremendous climatological change in the past. Where they existed on the earth may have migrated. And so one of the things that perhaps we need to get our heads around here in our little beloved neck of the woods is it may be that over time, not in the next 5 years, probably not in my lifetime, but 7 generations from now, it may be that the Santa Cruz Mountains are preserved, that there are forests, but they are not redwood dominant, but that there are redwoods elsewhere. Is that the right way to sort of think about this?
It's one way. I mean, when you look at geologic time, you have to remember that a very, very small movement that happens constantly over millions of years results in things like mountain ranges growing, islands moving, species like MetaSequoia colonizing central Alaska.
Right.
So, yeah, that's why one of the reasons that I claim to be an optimistic person is those small changes add up over time.
Yeah, and look how long these things have lasted. Not only the individuals, which I know many folks in this audience have already know about and marvel at the individual lifespan of some of these trees, but collectively, as a species, their resilience across time is pretty significant. All right, well, I've asked you a bunch of questions. I took longer than I should have. I'm going to open the floor to my colleagues to see if they have questions from the audience that we might have time to take. I really ate up a lot of your time. I apologize.
Thank you so much, Jason and John, for joining us today. A fair amount of questions, some related to fog, which I think you've covered, but one question was, why is the California upwelling so much more unpredictable than the other 3 areas in the world?
Oh, right. Okay. So this has to do with the natural variability of the Pacific Ocean. El Nino cycles are one real key reason that it's so unpredictable to try to project upwelling. And El Nino cycles operate over 4 to 7 year time periods. Those other upwelling cells, the Benguela Current, the Canary Islands, they're not as susceptible to that kind of subdecadal shifts. But there's also the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is yet another version of internal variability in the Pacific. This one operates over 40 to 70 to 80 year cycles. And so when those two are combined, it makes it really hard for a computer system to predict what's going to happen. There are really smart people that are working on that right now, and there's fascinating literature about it. But I mean, I'm a geologist. I look at the mud. And so what I can add to that is what has happened in the past. So that's where I've come in with our work, both myself and John, of course.
That's really helpful. Thank you. There were a couple questions about the sediment cores and what they have to tell us. And how much do you look at what the sediment cores tell us about the terrestrial ecosystems and what was dominating at what time? And in particular, one person asked what might the impact of something like large-scale logging or clearcutting maybe have on what you're seeing in the pollen record.
Yeah, that's a great question. There are lots and lots of different types of proxies that a geologist can throw at a sediment core. Some of the chemical proxies that I use, like stable isotopes, those systems can, under certain circumstances, actually distinguish between organic material that's derived from land versus organic material that's derived from ocean sources. In reference to your question about like, how would you see something like impact from clear cutting? One potential impact could be that you see more sediment runoff from those kinds of areas. That means you would get more sediment accumulation in something like a sediment core. Now, you'd have to also remember that the bioturbation that I showed you in that one pretty boring looking sediment core, that bioturbation would smear out something like a clear cut that happened, once a year in 10 years. If it was much more frequent and led to pretty significant changes in sediment removal and then transport to the ocean, you might be able to see it, but not necessarily. John, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, just from a land use change, I live in Redwood City, which got its name for when they were harvesting all the redwoods in the late 1800s. Well, all that harvesting meant they cut them down, they brought them to the bay, and it resulted in the southern part of the bay, the shoreline moved outward because of the increased sediment deposition. It stripped off a lot of the redwoods, of course, and most of the area that I go hiking in up in out north or west of Redwood City, there's young redwoods. They're growing. So again, on a lifetime, on a hundreds of years basis, you see the clear cutting is being replanted by new trees, but you do see this definite land use change, and ultimately. So, you know, I think it's a complicated question. We do, and another thing I add about what Jason's talking about, we have colleagues that work on fire records, charcoal records on both in the Mayan area of Guatemala and in the Western United States, and they can document fires. And what's emerged is, of course, the indigenous people used fires quite a lot to manage their ecosystem. And there's a lot of controversy now that fires are actually a good thing for forests and all. So it's a complicated issue, and we need to look at it from fresh perspectives.
Yeah, and that's something this audience has heard a fair bit about. Well, I want to thank you both. I'm sorry, we've run out of time, and we could probably go on for an extended period of time, but I want to thank you, Jason Addison and John Barron, for joining us. And thank you to our audience for joining us. Please join us next month. We will be joined by Alvaro Jaramillo, who's going to tell us a bit about birds of the Central Coast and some of the linkages between birds and our redwood forests in this region. And I know we've got a lot more information about the topics you both have been speaking about on our website. So please, if you're curious to learn more, check out sempervirens.org. And we can also try to pass on answers to any questions that you may send us via email. Jason and John, I'm sure will be happy to help us get you the answers you seek. So thanks to everyone, and we'll see you next month under the redwoods.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Matt. Yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Take care.